All right, so this time we are going to be talking about uh, deficiency and excess, which are two of the traditional understandings of how things go wrong in the human body. Deficiency is when there's not enough of something. Excess is when there's too much of something. Deficiency in some older texts might be referred to as privation. That's kind of a not a word that we really use in the English language anymore, but it meant essentially the same as deprivation, which means that you don't have enough of something that you need. So these are really key concepts that remain part of how we talk about health and disease in terms of modern pathology and physiology. The understanding has evolved a little bit over the centuries, but it's essentially still the same idea. And that idea is all about the idea of balance, that there are certain things in the body that need to be in balance with each other, and that the body seeks balance, which we might also refer to as homeostasis. Basically meaning the same state. Homeostasis is sort of like the normal operating situation of your body when nothing is out of balance with each other. And so deficiency and excess have always been really common. Both have always been really common. I think that in our present situation, in our present type of society, we tend to see a lot of excesses that we didn't used to see. And we see fewer states of deficiency, but states of deficiency are still very common, and they can be influenced by a lot of things. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So when people first started writing in English, or before that in Latin, about deficiency and excess, a lot of the time they were talking about it in a qualitative, metaphorical sort of way, where they were talking about observable things like heat, or they were talking about theoretical things like the four humors, like blood and phlegm and so forth, that they might not have actually seen, but that they might have felt like there was too much of, or that this particular element like fire was overrepresented in the body in a particular individual. So you could describe a fever as being an excess of heat. You could also describe a fever, if you were kind of approaching it from a more alchemical type of model, you could describe a fever as an excess of the fire element, which, again, that's kind of metaphorical because there isn't really any actual fire. Sometimes people would describe a fever as being an excess of blood, which it is not literally an excess of blood, but sometimes people thought of it in those terms and would relieve a fever by draining blood from the person, which does actually break a fever, but not because there was too much blood. So sometimes people had kind of the wrong idea, or maybe an imprecise or not literally correct idea about those sorts of excesses and deficiencies also. But there is still, was the general understanding that things had to be in balance in the body and could easily be thrown out of balance. So sometimes still, especially if you're dealing with traditional medical systems like traditional Chinese medicine, things might still be described in that sort of more of an alchemical and metaphorical type of paradigm type of description, where there might be an excess of a particular element or an excess of a particular humor or bodily fluid. I tend to go towards more plain language and more non-metaphorical things wherever possible. And so I might, not describe things in terms of fire and wind and so forth, and might describe them more just in terms of things that you can see and feel and touch. So describing a fever as an excess of heat is very literally true. There's more heat there than there should be. The person is physically hotter, and you can feel that with your touch or you can measure it with an instrument like a thermometer. And that can give you an idea of something that is going on. Of course, a fever is not purely a matter of excess the way that some other types of excess are, because it's an excess in terms of what the body is doing rather than what is in the body. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. But I'm going to talk a little bit about excess, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about deficiency and about the different kinds of excesses and deficiencies that you might expect to see in the course of working with people who whose bodies are out of balance, and working with people in your personal circle, whatever that may be, of people that you're working with. So there are a few different types of excesses, and one type of excess is this sort of thing that I've talked about things being out of balance in terms of, a more theoretical or constitutional type of form. Just a second. That's what I have over here. Another situation that you might have is an excess that results from exposure to something, especially exposure to a normal substance. We typically wouldn't call lead poisoning an excess of lead in the person, because there isn't a normal amount of it. We would say that, it's an exposure to a toxic substance. If somebody gets bitten by a snake, we don't really think of that as being an excess of snake venom. However, if it's a normal substance that somebody would be in contact with, we would describe that as an excess. One thing that you often see an excess of in people, or that can show up in people, you probably won't necessarily know what it is unless you either look at blood work that the person has had done, or unless you really know what you're looking for with that particular thing. But excess of minerals. Minerals are in our food, and sometimes larger amounts than normal are in them because of how they're processed or whatever. For example, something might get too much copper in it. Copper is a mineral that's in food. It's in the soil. It gets absorbed by food. If the food is processed in a way that adds copper to it, because some of the machinery used to process it contains copper, for instance, or if it is grown in a way that the plant is exposed to excess copper, which can happen with fruits from some fruit trees, for instance, then you can get an excess of copper in a person's body. And that can show up in all kinds of different ways. But that's just an example of something that you can get too much of, is minerals, which would include iron. You can actually have an excess of iron. You can get an excess of copper. You can get an excess of zinc. Any of the minerals that are normally potassium, sodium, magnesium, which are all electrolytes, you can easily get too much of. An excess of sodium, which is just basically from eating too much salt, is one of the most common mineral excesses that you would encounter, because so much sodium is used in food processing, so much salt especially, but also monosodium glutamate and some other food additives that contain sodium. So a sodium excess would often look like water retention and high blood pressure. So that's something that you might see and might be able to recognize. And the way that you deal with the sodium excess is by supporting the structures in the body that remove sodium, which in this case is the kidneys. And so if the person consumes less sodium and drinks more water, it'll tend to balance itself out unless something's wrong with the kidneys. And then that's a whole other more advanced type of situation. But that's something that you can often encounter as an excess, and that is pretty easily dealt with in most situations. Vitamins, you don't usually see excess of. It is possible, if somebody is megadosing on supplements, to see an excess of certain vitamins, especially vitamin A and vitamin E. Some forms of vitamin D also cause what's called hypervitaminosis, which is just too much of a vitamin. So it's possible to get an excess of vitamins. It's also possible to go your whole life without ever encountering that, because it pretty much only happens if somebody is taking large doses of oil soluble vitamins, and most people know not to do that if they're really into supplements. So it's not something you see as much anymore. And it doesn't happen with provitamins like beta carotene, which is sort of a form of vitamin A that isn't all the way finished and that your body has to do some work on before it's completely usable as vitamin A. Let's see. So another thing that you will see an excess of, or that you might encounter an excess of in a person's body, are products of metabolism. So that could be a lot of things. That could be anything that the body is making. So for example, if somebody has too much of a hormone, like hyperthyroid, that's a particular condition where there's an excess of a thyroid hormone. That would be an example of an excess in the body that is based on overproduction of a substance in the body. Nobody, well, I won't say nobody, because some people might, but for the most part, if somebody has too much thyroid activity, it's not because of something they're eating or drinking. It's not something that they're being exposed to from their environment. It's an excess that's originating in their body with an organ being overactive. Waste products are another example of something that can be an excess. If somebody's jaundiced, for instance, that means that their liver is producing more than necessary of certain substances, bilirubin and some liver enzymes and things like that, which will lead to a yellowish cast of the skin. And often this is a result of liver damage from a toxic substance, especially alcohol. Doesn't have to be alcohol, though. Lots of other substances will do it. But that's an example of an excess that you might see that's a product of metabolism. Diabetes, where there's an excess of glucose in the body, is another type of excess. And this isn't necessarily because people are consuming too much sugar. It's because, although that can exacerbate things if they're already out of balance, but it's because the body is actually producing more than it can handle, or it's producing it and not breaking it down as quickly as it might. So there's too much of it in the system at one time. So that's another example of an excess that is a product of metabolism, and it's not even a product that shouldn't be there. It's just that it's there in a larger amount than it should be, which is kind of the whole idea with excess. And before I mentioned in another class, I'd mentioned gout, which is when the body's depositing uric acid crystals into the joints, and that's an example of an excess of something building up in the body. So with all of these situations, there are a couple of ways of dealing with excess just in general. One of the ways is limiting exposure, and that's like the first thing you should do. If somebody has heat exhaustion because they're exposed to too much heat, the first thing you've got to do is get them out of the heat. If somebody has too much sodium in their system, the first thing that they've got to do is stop eating so much sodium, and so on. So there are a lot of things that you can do to correct excess that are just basically a matter of limiting exposure. And that should be kind of your first line, your first thing that you try to do when there's any kind of an excess. Another thing that you can do, like I mentioned with the sodium is supporting whatever structures in the body, whatever organs might help to balance out that excess. And if, for example, if there's an excess of sodium, you want to support the kidneys. If there were an excess of certain other substances, like fat-soluble vitamins, for instance, you would want to work on supporting the liver, because the liver is what metabolizes those. It's what helps get rid of them. So, supporting the different organs in the body that help to maintain homeostasis is an important part of this. And this is that process of supporting organs that create balance is a big part of traditional medicine all over the world. You'll find things like sweat lodges and cleanses and so forth. And a lot of the time that's what they're doing, is that they're trying to remove excesses from the body of whatever sort by giving some extra supports to the organs that deal with those particular excesses. Just a second. Okay, so someone asked, why does bloodletting reduce a fever? And there is actually some degree of truth to the fact that, well, the blood that's leaving is hot and it's taking heat with it. And that is part of what is going on. But another thing that happens when blood is released from the body, two things happen. One is that the blood vessels try to contract as a way of keeping the blood in, and that contraction of the blood vessels limits it interrupts the process that generates the fever, because the blood flow and oxygenation is necessary to create the fever. And so it's decreasing the amount of blood flow in the periphery, in the skin, and bringing it back towards the center of the body into the larger blood vessels. So there's less oxygen being delivered to the cells so that they can create the fever. And the other thing is sort of a shock type reaction where there's adrenaline and cortisone and things like that being released into the body that tends to make people tends to make the body temperature drop, even if there weren't actual blood leaving the system. That shocky type of feeling will tend to make the temperature drop in the body. It also might induce sweating, which will take away some heat with it as well. So it's a kind of a brutal way to approach reducing a fever, and it's not one that I recommend in nearly any situation. I mean, just, obviously it's not something that I'm training you to do, but it is something that people used to do because it was dramatic and produced a certain type of result. So that's something that used to be a pretty common thing for people to do for fevers. And like I said, it did get results, but it's not the most enlightened way to do it necessarily. As far as copper toxicity, there was another question about copper toxicity. For the most part, copper is also metabolized by the kidneys, so you're still going to want to get plenty of water and support the kidneys. And we've talked about some kidney supporting herbs like nettle and dandelion already, and those could be things that might be useful in that situation. There are other things that we haven't really talked about yet that are herbs that help to bind metals in the body so that they're more processable by the body to get them out of the system. And like I said, we haven't really gotten into that yet, although garlic would help a little bit with that process too, and that is an herb that we have talked about some. So it is possible to work on copper with some of the herbs that we've already studied in this class so far. So all of those things are ways that you can deal with excess, decreasing exposure, increasing activity of organs that deal with whatever the excess is. And then also along with that, sometimes it might be possible to slow down or calm down some of the organs that would be creating the excess, if the excess is a matter of something being created by the organs. So, for instance, in the case of an excess of blood sugar, cinnamon has actually been shown to be helpful with this, and that's a common and safe herb that it works by increasing how well the substance insulin works in the body, so decreasing cellular resistance to insulin. And so that's something that, for instance, would be working by triggering a different part of the metabolism, or that seeks homeostasis, that helps to produce homeostasis as far as that particular substance goes. So that's yet another way that you can deal with excess when it shows up. But the main thing with a lot of these things is trying to avoid excess in the first place, avoid the exposure, since a lot of the time it is a matter of exposure. And then on the same, the other side of the same prospect is deficiency, when there is not enough of something that the body needs. And this deficiency has always been a really huge issue for people, especially people who weren't in the most ideal life circumstances, which can include sick people, it can include poor people, it can include people who are going through a chaotic situation, that sort of thing. And the primary, most extreme forms of deficiency would be dehydration and starvation. And both of those are still really common. They're not at all things of the past, even in high resource countries like here in the United States. It's not at all a thing of the past that people go hungry or go thirsty. And perhaps some of you have experienced that. I know that I have at times in my life. But access to, I'm just going to talk about dehydration first, because that's sort of the most immediate, other than deprivation of air, which we'll deal with as sort of a separate topic later on. The lack of hydration is one of the fastest things that can throw your body out of balance, that can cause illness, that can cause death. It really only takes a matter of hours to get into a situation where you're dehydrated. And the places that you most often see that in real life and working with people close to you would be in a situation where somebody's either in a very hot situation where they're sweating a lot, or in a situation where they are having a lot of vomiting and or diarrhea and losing a lot of fluids. So you can have a deficiency because you're not taking in enough fluid, and you can have a deficiency because you're losing too much fluids, either through sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, or what have you. It's all unpleasant, but it's all very common. And the smaller a person's body is, the more susceptible they are to this. So children, babies can get dehydrated much more quickly and reach a dangerous point with it much more quickly than larger people. And smaller adults can reach a point with it more quickly than larger adults, all other things being equal, which of course they never really are. But just generally speaking, the larger your body is, the more water it contains and the longer it takes for you to get completely dehydrated. So in the case of somebody who's just out working in the hot sun or something like that, doing a lot of sweating, doing a lot of physical labor, just getting the water into their system is really important. And if it's an ongoing thing, this doesn't really matter so much if it's just like a matter of, one day or a few hours or something. But if somebody is chronically in a situation where they're sweating too much, where they're losing a lot of water through activity like that, or even if they're losing it the other ways that we'll talk about in just a second, it's important to have some electrolytes in with that, even if it's just a spoonful of sugar and half a spoonful of salt per gallon of water. That's an easy way to mix up something that's just kind of a very weak solution that's still palatable, but that is more rehydrating than water itself, because your body needs those other substances to help hold the water in, to help make the water able to get from your stomach into the cells of your body. So that's a good thing to be able to do. There are a lot of recipes out there for other solutions for rehydrating people. Switchel is one that's common in this part of the world, which is a combination of a little bit of vinegar and a little bit of honey and just a tiny bit of salt mixed in with water, and sort of maybe gives it a sweet, sour, salty taste. And the exact proportions of that might be a little different than the half a spoonful of salt and a spoonful of sugar, but it's along the same lines, and it's kind of more to taste, because if something's too salty, it'll be unpalatable. But rehydration solutions like that, there are also commercial things you can buy, like Pedialyte or Gatorade. Most of them have way more sugar than they need. So there's things like Emergency, which is kind of a fizzy drink mixture that has a little bit of sugar and a lot of different electrolytes in small amounts, and all of them are perfectly serviceable for rehydration. Even the ones with a lot of sugar in it, although too much sugar, the sugar takes water to process. So it's not as wet if there's too much sugar in it. But rehydration like that is a really important thing for you to be able to do if you're in charge of the health of a group of people, whether it's your kids, whether it's a group that you're doing first aid for, whatever it is. It's a really useful thing to know about. One very simple thing you can do to test if you think somebody might be dehydrated, and this only really works if they're pretty badly dehydrated, but people don't always know when they are dehydrated. So if somebody stands up and they feel dizzy, that's a pretty good sign that they are. If you're feeling somebody's pulse in their wrist and then have them stand up, and if their pulse quickens just from standing up, not from doing any other physical activity, that is a pretty good sign that they're hypovolemic, that they don't have enough fluid circulating in their circulatory system, which means that they're pretty dehydrated, and they're running a pretty bad state of deficiency. Surprisingly, thirst is not a reliable indicator for when you are dehydrated. So people don't always feel thirsty when they're dehydrated. So it's something where, especially if you're working with kids, or if you're working with sick people, if you're working with somebody who's a little bit nauseous and doesn't really like the idea of having something in their stomach, it might take some persuasion. It might take having to remind them to drink, because they might not feel like it. They might not feel like it's something that they want to do, but it's an important thing to kind of try and keep up with, because it's really easy, especially for children and sick people, but for anybody, it's pretty easy to get dehydrated. So that's really the most common form of deficiency, and one of the more dangerous ones, because it's one that can progress pretty quickly. Another area, and this is kind of a different type of deficiency, but another area where you often see deficiency in modern people is sleep, which is more about a deficiency of a particular function. Sleep is a function of the nervous system that has an effect on the circulatory system and really everything else in the body. And so if someone is not sleeping enough, that sleep deficit builds up just like any other deficiency in the body. Last time we talked about some herbs that are helpful for sleep, hawthorn and chamomile. Having a good sleep situation is really important, of course. And so, good sleep is a huge cornerstone of health, especially mental health, but really physical, everything. It plays a huge role in it. And it's something that in our earning and spending obsessed culture that we often push to the wayside, or that people will even often kind of be proud of the fact that they haven't slept or don't sleep as much, because it makes it seem like they're hard workers, that sort of thing. And there are good things about being a hard worker, but there are also really good things about not working yourself to death. So, and I think that a lot of the time people really do shorten their own lives through deficiency of sleep. So that's an area of deficiency that you really want to look at with any kind of health problem. Every time somebody comes into my clinic, I talk to them about sleep. I mean, every intake that I do, I ask, how's your sleep? Is it, are you waking up feeling well rested? Are you sleeping well enough that you remember your dreams when you wake up? And so forth. I just really try and make sure that that piece is there, because it's always relevant. It's always going to make a difference to how the person feels and whether or not they are able to heal from whatever they have going on. And so that's another area where there's a lot of deficiency in our society and culture that people might not look for. And I kind of feel like if you're not really getting good rest, well, what do you need a civilization for? If you still got to work yourself to death, well, you can do that living out in the woods by yourself. You don't really need it doesn't really serve much point to have all the advancements in the world that we have if you're still not able to get the rest that you need. And then, of course, dietary stuff is another area of deficiency. And there are two broad categories that we talk about in terms of deficiency with dietary things. One of them is protein and energy, and one of them is micronutrients like vitamins and minerals. So I'm going to kind of deal with those a little bit separately. Protein and energy malnutrition is basically like good old-fashioned starvation, bad old-fashioned starvation, if you will. You lose weight, your systems stop working so well, you lose body fat percentage, which means that you don't have the chemical building blocks for a lot of hormones and things like that, which causes a lot of other problems. And of course, eventually it can lead to death, but way before that, it leads to lack of energy and vitality. And of course, like I said, some hormonal changes and things like that. Calories are pretty easy to come by in most high resource places like the United States. Even in medium resource countries, usually calories are pretty easy to come by. Protein is not quite as easy to come by, but it's there. It's there more than some other nutrients are. So, if you just eat rice, you'll get enough calories and probably enough protein, possibly enough protein. If you just eat corn, you'll get enough protein and calories, but you'll get deficiencies in other things. So it's possible to be malnourished, to be undernourished, and still have enough protein and calories. So it's not the most common type of malnutrition in a lot of the world today, but it's also not at all rare. So you can have people who are not getting enough calories and not getting enough energy and protein for a number of reasons. The most common reason is loss of appetite. People get sick and they don't feel like eating. They're sick to their stomach. Maybe they have, pain in their digestive system, that sort of thing. It makes people just not want to eat. And so they can lose weight. They can even starve to death. And that's something that you see in inflammatory situations that involve the digestive tract. Sometimes it's a thing that you see in people who are on certain medications like chemotherapy drugs. So it's not at all something that's a thing of the past or something that doesn't happen around here. It's still pretty common, all things considered. Of all the things that can go wrong with the human body, it's not one of the less common ones. Another situation where people don't get enough calories or enough protein is when there are substance abuse issues, especially alcohol and stimulants. These things might make people not feel any sense of hunger. And so it's very common for people who are abusing stimulants, or even people who are prescribed stimulants and taking them exactly as directed sometimes, and people who are drinking to excess will often be eating to deficiency. So that's a very common scenario. Right along with that, you have eating disorders in which people don't want to eat, don't eat for psychological reasons, and sensory integration disorders where people might just kind of, maybe they want to eat, maybe they don't have anything psychologically against eating, but the feeling of food, the texture of food might just kind of really disgust them, or make them unable to take in or keep down food. So that's a very common scenario as well. And then there are also people who, for whatever reason, have malabsorption issues, where they might be eating as much food, they might be taking in as much food, but they might not be absorbing the nutrients from it. So that's a common scenario as well. If you see enough people, you'll see that kind of scenario more than a few times. So these are all situations where someone might actually be starving, in spite of the fact that we most of us are in a part of the world where there's a lot of food around. Actually, here in the United States, over the last 30 years, there's kind of become a correlation between poverty and obesity, where people are actually taking in more calories than they need more often if they're poor, because it's kind of a complicated set of political and socioeconomic factors that lead to this situation, but basically high calorie food is cheap. There's a lot of cheap high calorie food that doesn't satisfy in other ways, that might leave people still hungry, so they keep eating. And that's kind of a matter of an excess form of malnutrition. So that's or excess of calories and maybe deficiency of some other things. So all of those are pretty common scenarios in the world that I live in, and where most of you live too. So that's something to be aware of. And then along with that, I mentioned that there's, besides the protein and energy category, there is the micronutrients category. And this would be people being deficient in a specific nutrient. And a lot of these specific nutrient deficiencies have names and have recognizable clinical patterns that people recognized before they even knew enough about food chemistry to have given names to the substances. So scurvy, for instance, is a vitamin C deficiency. And we've known what scurvy was for a lot longer than we've known what caused it. We basically, some people figured out pretty early on that there was something about the diet in certain situations, where if you were living on bread and water, or salted meat and crackers or something like that, something was missing from your diet that you would be getting if you were eating a more rounded and varied diet. So vitamin D deficiency is called rickets. There's a bunch of them. And you can read more about those if you want to. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies, especially vitamin deficiencies, all of which still exist, because vitamin D is partly a matter of exposure to sunlight. Rickets kind of had a resurgence in early on in the 21st century, where people were not going out in the sun and not letting their kids go out in the sun very much, and always putting a lot of sunscreen on them and so forth. So they weren't metabolizing enough vitamin D through sun exposure. So some children were actually developing rickets, which is recognizable by causing changes in how the bones are developing. So there is, still the potential for any of these things to happen. Scurvy, something you probably wouldn't see except if somebody were on a very restricted diet, possibly for any of the reasons that I just mentioned under the category of why they would be deficient in protein and calories. So these things can go along with protein and energy malnutrition. It's a question of how many IUs is too many for vitamin D. I'm not really sure. I have seen a study where they gave people 25,000 IU of vitamin D a day for 6 months, and nobody had any hypervitaminosis, any symptoms of too much. And this was with vitamin D3. Most of the documented cases of people getting too much vitamin D were with synthetic vitamin D, vitamin D2, which is not really even used that much anymore in food production or in vitamins. It still exists, it's still legal, but it's not very common anymore. So I don't worry too much about getting too much vitamin D. I usually take 20,000 IU in the wintertime. That's a lot. It's probably more than is necessary. 5,000 IU is also a lot, possibly more than is necessary, but well within the realm of what's not going to cause problems. So, the 100%, the US recommended daily allowance of vitamin D is basically just the minimum amount you need to prevent rickets. But there is a growing body of evidence that the optimum amount of vitamin D is much different than that. So it would be, quite a bit higher than what's considered 100% in nutrition labeling. Just a second. There's a question of whether constipation would cause dehydration. Not usually, but constipation can cause people to not want to take anything in. So it can cause a lack of wanting to eat or drink anything. And sometimes that might lead to dehydration. But usually it's more the other way around, that the dehydration would lead to constipation. And then there was also a question of whether people with an unhealthy vegetarian diet were protein or fat deficient. You could be either one, depending on the direction in which your diet was unhealthy. But usually not protein deficiency. Protein deficiency, unless somebody's really just like living on starch, if they're only eating pasta or whatever, they might get protein deficient. But even that's got some protein in it, so maybe not. So it's, it just kind of depends on what their diet does or doesn't consist of. It's very possible to have a vegetarian diet that has plenty of protein and plenty of fat in it, though. It just sort of depends on what you eat, and that's, extremely variable. So, a question of whether there were herbal remedies that provide a lot of vitamin D. Not so much. You can get good fats from seeds, and those will help your body to produce vitamin D. Um, Vitamin D is kind of mostly produced in the liver, so a lot of the time we're getting it from eating. If you're getting it directly in your diet, it's often from eating other things that had a liver, so like fish oil or animal fats, things like that. But it's also possible for your body to produce it uh, from fats and things like that. So it's not something that's so much that you get from plants directly, although it is possible to have some fungus, some mushrooms and things do contain some vitamin D. They're a little bit different in terms of their metabolic pathways and what substances they're able to contain compared to actual plants. So deficiencies of micronutrients, again, not the most common thing, but not that rare either. Yeah. And then, of course, just like with excesses in former times, people would talk about constitutional deficiencies. People might talk about yang qi deficiency in terms of traditional Chinese medicine, or a heat deficiency or something like that. And often that's kind of, maybe, like I said, more metaphorical or cultural understanding of what's going on. That's not as literal. People would often talk about blood deficiency, though, which could mean anemia. Sometimes people basically mean that somebody is anemic when they're talking about their blood being deficient or having blood that is needs to be built up, which is something you run into in both Western and Eastern traditional types of medicine. And the nettles, which I mentioned before, are really good for that. Just about any leafy greens would be what herbalists might describe as blood building, and helping to kind of provide the substances that the body needs to make high quality blood. And then the last category of deficiency would be deficiency of activity of a particular organ or system. And we might also describe that as weakness. So, you could say that somebody's has a weak heart, and that means that the heart is kind of deficient in terms of its activity. It's not moving things around as much as you would like it to, for instance. But that type of language is a little bit ambiguous, because someone might also say that somebody has weak lungs, when what they really mean is that the lungs are reactive and are easily inflamed or easily bothered by outside stuff, outside stimuli. But a lot of the time we could talk about someone being deficient in the action of a particular organ. And then in that case, what you want to do is make sure that the person has good basic nutrition and then support the specific organ. So if somebody has a weak heart, the hawthorn that we talked about last time is good for helping the heart, but you also have to make sure that they're getting enough protein to build muscle tissue out of, and that they're getting enough electrolytes to make the electrical impulses move the way that they need to, for instance. So, the hawthorn is not really going to have the best possible effect in someone who's starving, or someone who is getting not enough potassium, or someone who is getting too much sodium. So all of these things, all of this homeostasis and balancing out deficiencies and excesses is really important for being able to support the structures and functions, which is our goal with all of these different herbs that we're using. And so as far as priorities go, most of the time, if you've got some excess and some deficiency, work on the deficiencies first. A lot of the time, the excesses will fix themselves if the deficiencies do. So that's something to be aware of. If you're feeling that there's a deficiency and an excess of different things, work on the deficiencies first, because the body's ability to right itself, the body's ability to produce homeostasis, to find balance, is interfered with by the deficiencies. And so trying to curb an excess without trying to tonify the deficiencies is often going to be a fool's errand. It's often not going to work at all, or maybe not as well as you would like it to, unless you can get the deficiencies and the weaknesses sorted out first. Let's see. So for instance, let's say somebody had, let's go back to our example of gout, of the acid crystals, the waste products being deposited in the joints. And that's an excess, right? But it's also might be related to a weakness of the kidneys. So if you're giving somebody something to flush those acid crystals out, but you're not strengthening the kidneys, then you're not really going to be able to get rid of them. So you have to first tonify the deficiencies, first strengthen the weak parts, and then work on decreasing the excesses. Similarly, if somebody had a fever, let's say a medieval physician comes along and says, okay, we're going to bloodlet this person who's horribly malnourished. A lot of the time that killed people because they were trying to deal with the excess and ignoring the fact that there was an underlying deficiency. So that's something that I hope you will all remember as just sort of a general rule. Anytime you're dealing with a complicated situation where there are excesses and deficiencies together, where somebody has a bunch of different things wrong with them, which can be as simple as being both old and sick, which happens to us all eventually if we live long enough. So you have some deficiencies, maybe because your body doesn't work as well as it used to, and then you have some excesses because you've been exposed to something, or your body's having a reaction to something that's not usual. And so you want to work on the deficiencies, and then if that doesn't take care of the excesses, then work on the excesses as well. So that's something, a really important thing to remember. And hopefully, you can use this concept of deficiencies and excess to kind of give some sort of framework to your use of what herbs you're using in what situations moving forward. And this is, what we call therapeutics, basically having this theoretical foundation for why we use a particular herb in a particular situation. And that's kind of the difference between really being an herbalist, being a serious student of herbal medicine, versus just being somebody who knows a few remedies for a few things, is really having this theoretical framework of an understanding of why you're doing what you're doing, because that allows you to make changes to it. That allows you to say, okay, I want to do something that's going to increase sweating because I want to deal with this excess heat that's in this fever in this person. And then maybe if one particular herb for that doesn't work, then another one would, instead of just saying, okay, I know lemon balm might help lower a fever. I know feverfew might help lower a fever, and, throwing different things at it without knowing which ones might work in a particular situation. So any questions about deficiency and excess before I move on to talk a little bit about a couple of different herbs for this week? All right, so the herbs that I'm going to talk about this week are raspberry and mullein. Mullein, by mullein, I mean Verbascum thapsus. There are a couple other herbs that are related that are also called mullein, like moth mullein, but I'm not talking about them today. I'm just talking about regular old mullein, whose Latin name is Verbascum thapsus. Mullein is a common weed in a lot of the temperate zones of the world. It's especially in the northern hemisphere. It's in my environment, it's the only weed that has large furry leaves. There are some other leaves that are large and have hairs on them, but mullein is almost like a flannelly kind of texture. The name mullein is from the Latin word mollis, meaning soft. It's distantly related to the word woolen in English, but it's called this because it's soft and it's kind of a common weed in rocky places. It'll grow, I always see it along the railroad tracks that are between my house and my clinic, growing out of the big rocks, the large gravel alongside the railroad. It likes that type of environment. It likes bare ground. It likes, it will grow sometimes in cracks in pavement. Well, that's not really the ideal place to harvest it from. But it likes rocky ground with a lot of good drainage. When it first comes up, it's a basal rosette, which is a structure we've talked about before, where you have a bunch of leaves coming out from a central point and kind of pointing in all directions. And the first year, and sometimes the first couple of years, depending on how much sunlight it's getting, it's just that. It's just the basal rosette of flannelly large leaves. And then on the second year, or sometimes the third or fourth year, once it's stored up enough solar energy, enough calories from the sunlight, it puts up a flowering stalk. And the flowering stalk has leaves along it. And it grows maybe 6 feet tall or so, sometimes a little shorter, sometimes a little taller. And it has yellow flowers towards the top of the stalk and makes lots of little tiny seeds. So this plant has a variety of different uses. And the one that is most well known to people in the US who are learning about herbal medicine is for respiratory support. And a lot of people kind of misunderstand the scope of mullein's respiratory support. Mullein does two things for the respiratory system. It is an expectorant and it's a bit of an anti-inflammatory. So an expectorant, I mean, it provokes coughing and breaks up phlegm and makes people cough stuff up. I don't really like mullein for dry coughs because it makes people cough and there's nothing for it to break up in a dry cough, although it does decrease inflammation sometimes. So in the 1800s, and well, not just in the 1800s, but there's a tradition of people smoking mullein to break up congestion. This is a very harsh remedy, especially for someone who doesn't normally smoke. If you breathe in mullein smoke, it's probably going to make you cough and cough and cough, possibly to the point of feeling sick. It's not really necessary to do it that way either. You can drink mullein tea. It will still make you cough. It will still break up phlegm. And actually the hot liquid might be more soothing to your chest than the hot smoke. Like I said, especially if you're not used to breathing in smoke. Just a sec. There's a comment that it's like Mucinex. Yeah, it's like Mucinex. It's an expectorant. It breaks up phlegm. So it's not an all-purpose remedy for the respiratory system necessarily. It does actually have some anti-inflammatory properties too. Sometimes it's helpful in certain types of asthma, but a lot of the time it will provoke coughing. And for some people, especially if their asthma is more spastic than inflammatory, it might make it worse. So That's the thing that most people know about mullein, is that it's for the respiratory system. And the thing that I want you to know about mullein for the respiratory system is that it's mostly an expectorant and to a lesser extent an anti-inflammatory. And the other thing I want you to know about mullein is that that is not its only use. In addition to being expectorant, mullein is also calming. It's slightly calming. I have used mullein when I first started doing herbal medicine. A lot of the time I was homeless. I was a homeless teenager, and I was helping a lot of other people who were living on the streets. And I had heard from the community that I grew up in East that mullein was helpful for. It actually really took the edge off for some people. So that's a good thing to know about it, is that it is calming and kind of slightly antipsychotic, I guess you could say. But it takes the kind of, someone described it to me as kind of making the creepy crawly feelings less intense, which is also something that people use tobacco for, but mullein is, maybe a little better for you than tobacco. So that's mullein tea, just like what you would use for the coughing, can be helpful in that situation. I also really like mullein flower oil, which is when you take the flowers from mullein and steep them in oil and let it sit. The way that I do it is I put it in avocado oil, which I like because it's kind of a clear oil, and the mullein flowers are yellow. And I like to be able to see it turn the oil yellow so that I know that it's really like getting out into the oil. Whereas if you put it in a lot of other oil, the oil's already yellow and you can't really see the difference. So I like to put it in that and then let it sit somewhere warm for about 2 days. And that helps it to infuse out into the oil, and then kind of strain it through a screen and press what you can out of the oil. I use like a little tea strainer and then press the plant material with a spoon. And this is, I try to use about 1 flower for every teaspoon of oil. So how's that for a proportion? I don't ever really weigh them or anything, but I just try to figure out, 6 teaspoons to an ounce. So a dozen flowers to 2 ounces, and so on. And that's the proportion that I use, which is not extremely precise, but it's reproducible anyway. So this form of mullein, and you can also actually make an oil infusion out of the leaves, but I use that a little bit different. But the oil extract of the flowers is my favorite way of using it as a remedy for the nervous system. Like I said, it's calming. It's not sleep producing. It's not something that's going to make somebody fall asleep, but it might make them less anxious. It might help with things like sensory integration issues, or maybe some of the discomfort, and some of might take the edge off some from paranoia and delusions and things like that. So it's and some with anxiety. I've never used it by itself for anxiety, because there are a lot of other things that are kind of different and stronger, but it's a good remedy to use. It's also, that particular form of the remedy helps to provoke circulation. So if you have an area on the body that is not getting good circulation, putting some mullein oil on it can help circulation to it. So that's good for non-healing wounds. And you can do the same thing, that part, not so much the mental part of it, but that part you can also do with an oil extract made from the leaves. And with the leaves, because they're kind of tougher, I actually dry them, crush them up, and simmer them in oil for about 15 minutes. And that is something that you can use as a liniment for wounds that aren't healing. Pressure sores. I had someone that I was working with who was not very able to get up and move around the house. They were mostly laying in bed most of the time, and they would get sores on their body from not moving around so much. And so mullein can actually, which is, something that if somebody has help with, they can actually move around, get moved around and not have those pressure sores. But if they develop, or if somebody has non-healing sores on their feet because they don't have good sensation in their feet and their shoes don't fit right, or they otherwise injure them and they're just not healing, anything like that, mullein is really good for helping the circulation to the area. It's mildly antibacterial, and it's sort of just kind of warming. It's as though you've taken the flannelly aspect of it and put that into a liniment, and it's like a warming flannelly liniment that you can rub on someone's chilblains, or I actually used it myself on a frostbit area that I had on a toe from being in a snowy area and being out in it for too long, and I got a minor blister type frostbite on one of my toes, and it hurt for a long time, but I would put the mullein oil on it and it helped it heal up better. So it's a good remedy for that sort of thing. The mullein is really easy to grow from seed if you have an area of bare ground with good drainage, whether it's gravel or sand or just dirt. You can scatter the seeds and you don't really have to do much to them. You don't have to really cultivate it or anything. You just kind of press the seeds into the ground, scatter them on the ground and step on them, that kind of thing. The seeds are smaller than poppy seeds. They're very tiny. Mullein stem, the fruiting stalk, basically after the flowers are gone, is maybe a foot, 2 feet long on a long stem, and makes thousands of little tiny seeds. It's a weed, it's not native to this part of the world. It's native to the Mediterranean and got spread throughout the world got spread throughout Europe when people were moving from that area throughout Europe, and then got spread from Europe to the rest of the world. And the actual spent stalk can be used as a torch. You can stick it in the fire and it burns for a long time. Sometimes people would dip them in oil or pitch also, so that it burns for even longer. But the fruiting stalk actually has some oily feeling to it. So yeah, mullein has quite a few different uses beyond just being something for the respiratory system. And what's the oral dose on the flower oil? I usually use like about a milliliter at a time. I haven't ever encountered a dose that I felt like was too much or that was causing problems. Sometimes what I'll do is give people a bottle of it and tell them, take a milliliter first thing in the morning, and then take a few drops under your tongue as often as you need to throughout the day with the dropper bottle. And so that's one way of administering it that I've had pretty good results with, and that's usually what I do. Hang on just a second. If you want to gather mullein flowers, at least where I live, they're starting to bloom now. And they'll continue blooming for a month or two. But it's a really easy plant to identify. There probably aren't any other plants where you live that are growing on their own that look like it. Around here, occasionally you'll see some stachys, some lamb's ear that's escaped from cultivation. that's fuzzy, but it's not really the same size or the same shape. So it's pretty easy to recognize even when it's not in flower. You can find the basil leaves growing just about all year long. Just a second. But right now, when it's just starting to flower, is actually the best time to gather them. Is mullein used for kidney dysfunction? Mullein is very slightly diuretic. It's not something that I would usually use for kidney dysfunction because there are a lot of other things that I do use, but it is slightly diuretic, and it's used differently. It has a lot of different uses in different areas that people have fixated on, or that people, like I said, people here in the United States mostly use it as a respiratory remedy, but it does a lot of other things. People in Central Asia mostly used it as an anti-inflammatory for bug bites and things like that, like crushing it up and poulticing it on a bug bite. Here we've got a lot of other things that work better for that, so I'd never use it for that, but it is something that people can do with it. So yeah, it does work a little bit for the kidneys. I like dandelion a lot better for the kidneys, for instance, so I don't tend to use it, or nettle sometimes along with a demulcent herb like mallow, marshmallow, or something like that. But yes, mullein can be used for the kidneys. It can be used as an anti-inflammatory. Poultices of mullein leaves can actually be used for pain, for painful wounds, to speed wound healing. And the way this is made is you wash the leaf off and you just roll it with a rolling pin or something like that, where you're breaking the little vessels inside of it, and then apply the slightly damp leaf to a wound and put a bandage over it. And that will actually kind of help provoke blood flow to the wound and speed healing of it. That's another way that it's been used. It's also been used that similarly for arthritic joints. So especially in the feet, you can wrap the feet in mullein leaves, and that keeps them warm, and it provokes the blood flow both through the mechanical action of its little bristles, its little hairs, and through the chemicals that are in it, the substances that are in it. So it has a lot of different uses. Even though, mostly, I also mostly use it for its respiratory effects. But like I said, with the respiratory thing, it's important to be clear that it's not for all respiratory situations, because a lot of people tend to think that it is, and it's a good respiratory herb. There are a lot of situations where other things might be better, though. But for some people, it's the only one they know, and so it's what they gravitate towards every time. But if you're making tea out of it, prepare to cough, even if you're using it for something else. And yeah, don't smoke it. Probably sometimes has been smoked, often by itself or mixed with tobacco. Sometimes people call it like wild tobacco, or I've seen it called Indian tobacco. I really hate words like that because it's not actually a tobacco, and that just kind of seems confusing. And I think that if any tobacco is going to be Indian tobacco, it should just be like, tobacco, because we got all of that from Native American people. That's where it all came from. So Native Caribbean people, especially in the case of the commercial variety of tobacco. So yeah, mullein's good herb to know about, good, easy herb to recognize. It's versatile, has uses in multiple different systems of the body. I've heard that back when there were fewer people and more fish, that people would use the flowers or the seeds as sort of fish poison, like scatter them on the surface, and fish would eat them and then get killed or incapacitated by it, and be easy for people to catch. But that's not really a very ethical way to fish, especially with as many people and as few fish as there are right now. But it is an interesting historical usage, I think. So there's a comment that when trying to make a smoke blend with mullein, it needed to be mixed with a lot of other stuff in order to burn properly, because it's not the most its texture is not the best for that. But it does make a lot of smoke if you do light it. It makes kind of almost like a greasy kind of smoke, like a lot of thick smoke. So I don't really like smoking herbs very much in general. I mean, there's a limited set of scenarios, like if somebody couldn't keep anything liquid down at all, where it might be an appropriate thing to do. Also, it's possible to make the mullein oil from the leaves and rub that on the chest, and that might be an easier way to apply mullein in a small child than trying to get them to drink the tea. I've used it in that way as well. But yeah, the mullein leaf oil is a nice warming type of thing without it being hot in the same way that cayenne is. It's kind of warming in a frictiony sort of way rather than a spicy sort of way. So the next herb that I wanted to talk about is raspberry. And in most English language herbal books, they talk about raspberry, they're talking about red raspberry, specifically Rubus idaeus, which is one particular variety of raspberry. But there are a lot of species of raspberries out there. If you go out in the woods around here, you're likely to find black raspberry, which is in fruit right now. There's also an invasive variety called wineberry, which is a red raspberry that's covered in little prickles. I mean, the stem is covered in little prickles, not so much the berry itself. It's becoming more common around here. And what I'm going to say is mostly about red raspberry, but it applies to both of those as well. So there are a few different parts of raspberry that are commonly used medicinally. There's the fruit, there's the leaf, and the root. The root is not used that often, but it is used and it is useful. I don't really use the stems medicinally. People have used the stems medicinally, but I don't really, so I'm not going to get into that so much. But the fruit is a very nice part of the plant. It's a very lovely thing to eat, whether you're talking about red raspberries or black raspberries. I have a bunch of black raspberries at the back of my yard. I've been eating on them for the past 10 days or so since they started getting ripe, and my chickens and my raccoons have been as well. They're not really my raccoons, they're just, they're around. So the fruit's edible, it's very delicious. It's also full of antioxidants, mild anti-inflammatory substances. If you really, really, really want to do a lot of work, you can smash up the fruit, strain out the seeds, and press oil from the seeds. I have never really gone to the trouble myself, but the oil from the seeds is meant to be really helpful to the skin and to help with skin healing. But the fruit itself is, like I said, antioxidant. If you if you were in a situation where you weren't able to buy commercially produced vinegar or alcohol, and you wanted to make your own, raspberry is a very good local source that you could do that from. I often make a raspberry vinegar, which I use in cooking, and which I have also used as to make vinegar extracts, which you can make vinegar extracts of a lot of different herbs. It gets the minerals out and it gets some other substances out of them. But I have a raspberry extract of willow bark, for instance, or a raspberry extract of violet petals. And both of those are things that I use medicinally on something of a regular basis, not real frequently, but they're good anti-inflammatory remedies. And in both of those, the raspberry and its antioxidant substances play a little bit of a role, and then the thing that it's acting as a carrier for plays the main role in terms of the anti-inflammatory thing. So it's a good thing to use as an excipient. In other words, you can use it as an ingredient in formulas that is something other than the main medicinal ingredient. If you want to make alcohol or juice that is flavored, or vinegar, then raspberry is a source for all of that. If you make a preserve of the raspberry, and that can be used orally, especially if you strain the seeds from it, it can be used kind of as a sort of a medicinal electuary, a sweet medicine that can be used for helping to normalize bowel movements, especially in children, because it contains sugars, and it also contains astringent substances. So the sugars will help draw some water into the intestine, but the astringent substances will keep too much water from coming in. So it can be used for constipation, or it can be used for diarrhea. Especially, like I said, in children whose bodies are pretty sensitive. The main part that is commercially used medicinally from raspberries is the leaf. And the leaf has a couple of different things going for it. One of which is that it's nutritive. It contains some B vitamins, it contains some iron, some minerals, a little bit of protein, lots of folic acid, and it's good for being a nourishing beverage. And then it's also a uterine tonic. Raspberry contains some substances that sort of increase circulation into the tissue of the uterus, and so it can help with cramps, can help with making periods more regular, can help with promoting fertility. Sometimes you'll see warnings that people shouldn't use raspberry leaf while pregnant because it's stimulating to the uterus. And those are actually based on a study that was done in rodents. And it would be really probably hard to get enough raspberry, not impossible, but difficult to get enough raspberry to cause any sort of problems with pregnancy. And traditionally it is used during pregnancy, both because it's nourishing and because it's warming to the tissues that are involved. So it's kind of, people will often describe it as a uterine tonic. And it's something that I use a lot with other substances for fertility, for menstrual issues. It's pretty good for all that. And just, it's something that a lot of people use as a remedy for discomfort associated with periods. And so that's one of its most common uses, one of the most common things that if you go to a place that sells herbs and look at the products that contain red raspberry, it's mostly going to be leaves, and it's mostly going to be labeled with reference to that type of effect. So that's what a lot of people are using it for. Oh, excuse me.
I have kind of a possibly stupid question.
What's that?
So when you say a black raspberry, are you referring to what I am thinking of as a blackberry, a wild blackberry, or is that something different?
Something slightly different. So the real
How can you tell the difference too? That's something else. How could I tell the difference between the two?
Okay, so what makes the difference between a blackberry and a raspberry is that when you pick a ripe raspberry, the stem doesn't come off with it, and it kind of comes off like a little thimble. And a blackberry doesn't. It takes the central part with it, so it contains, even if you pick the stem off of it, the little clusters of round circular fruits are connected to a white receptacle that's under them. And with a blackberry, it's like hollow in the middle. I mean, with a raspberry, it's hollow in the middle. It's like a thimble composed of the little fruits, but they look very similar. They're on thorny bushes. Botanically, they're not wholly separate things. They're all part of the same genus. And some species we call raspberries and some species we call blackberries. With the main ones that grow around here, the raspberry has a smooth, waxy stem, and the blackberry has a sort of with a round cross section. If you were to cut through the stem, it would be like a circle. With a blackberry, if you cut through the stem, it would be star shaped. So it has like grooves that run along the whole length of the stem. But the main thing that defines it as a blackberry versus a raspberry is how it comes off when you pick the berry. But they're all closely related. But what I'm saying is more about red and black raspberries than what I would call a blackberry, which is a very closely related plant with a slightly different berry. But the blackberries are more astringent. So if you're taking them, you don't necessarily want to drink it as a tea in most situations. It would just be like kind of too sour and too astringent. There would be situations where you would want to use it as medicinally, but it's not quite the same. It's not as gentle as the red raspberry or the black raspberry. So they're closely related, and you can go online and look up the pictures of them and see the difference between blackberry and a black raspberry, both of which are native. The ones that are ripe right now are black raspberries. The blackberries are going to get ripe in another couple weeks, a week or two, is when they'll start getting ripe, and they'll continue getting ripe up until, I don't know, maybe even the middle of August. And so you probably have both near your house.
I do.
You might not have ever noticed the difference between them.
I have a bunch of blackberries, but you said black raspberry, and I was like, huh, is that a thing? Maybe I should go explore. Maybe I have that too, and I probably do, but I haven't found it yet.
Yeah, you probably do if you go and look for them. Yeah, and there were both of them growing out at the farm that we went to on May 28th. If you look at that video, there are probably some places where I talk about the difference between them, I think, but I couldn't swear to it, but I believe that I looked at the difference between the two things and talked about that during the video, which is up on the YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so yeah, the leaf often made into a tea. I keep the tincture of it around here too. Let's see. Somewhere around here. Jug of gallon jar of raspberry leaf tincture, which I go through at least 4 of those in the course of a year. So it's something that I use in tincture form quite a bit. And the nice thing about raspberry leaf is you can harvest it a few times a year, and you can harvest a whole lot of it. So usually what I do is I go out after the fruit has been made, and I gather a bunch of it because it's a really prolific plant and it will really take over large areas if allowed to. So I go out after it's fruited and I trim back my raspberry bushes, which I have a section of them that is about 25 feet long and about 3 feet deep along my back fence. And I cut down anything that's growing outside of the area where I want them to grow, which usually there's quite a bit of. And then I trim back the stuff that's growing in the area where I want it to grow. And usually between doing those things, I get a couple large bundles of raspberry, maybe like, I don't know, 20 pounds or so of raspberry canes. And then I strip the leaves off of those and get a lot of leaves. And I do that about 4 times a year. starting next week or so, and then once a month or once every month or two from then up until they freeze, up until the hard freeze in the winter, they'll keep putting out new leaves. So you can get a lot of raspberry leaf from a small area. And it's something that you really don't have to worry too much about not having enough of. And it dries nicely. It keeps pretty well. You can crush up the leaves and have them ready to use as tea. And if you use them this year, it's great. If you use them next year, it's just about as good. They don't have a lot of volatile substances in them the way that mint would or whatever. Not a lot of aromatic substances that would be evaporating out of them. So it's mostly just stuff that comes out when it's put in water. So as long as you keep it dry, it keeps pretty well. So it's a really good remedy, a good household remedy, and it's good to grow. You can grow it yourself, or you can go out and find it in pastures and fields and stuff, and you can get a lot of it. And so in addition to the tonic and nutritive properties that I already talked about, it's also astringent. And you can use raspberry tea as a wash or a compress. You can use it on acne. You can use it on bug bites and things like that. One of the first uses that I learned for raspberry leaf was to crush up the leaf and put it on a splinter, and it will draw the splinter out of the skin. And at least sometimes it will, depending on how badly it's trapped by the tissue around it. But a lot of the time it actually works pretty well, because that astringency is causing the tissue around it to tighten up, and that will push the intruding foreign body, the splinter, out. So just crushing it up and holding it on there. And I've always thought it was kind of neat, because it's like the leaf was the remedy for the thorn. You get the prickle in your skin, you can get it out with the leaf. And so that's one of the early first aid uses of it that I learned as a kid growing up out in the woods, and not something that a lot of people come into the clinic for. Don't have a lot of people coming in here like, I've got a splinter. But if you're using it as a home remedy, you might run into that sort of thing now and again. And if you have it in tea bags, you can actually just get the tea bag wet and put that as a poultice over a splinter or a thorn or whatever that you want to draw out. And or you can have a piece of cloth, a washcloth that's been wetted with the tea or something like that, and you can use that. It's also good for rashes, bug bites, things like that, because of its astringent properties. And so it's a good remedy for the skin and for minor injuries. And then finally, the root of raspberry can also be used medicinally. And the root is kind of harsh. It's also sort of a pain to dig up. But if you pry the root out and you wash all the mud off of it, and the root is prickly just like the above ground parts are, it can have thorns on it too. It doesn't always, but it can have thorns on it too. So the root would be made as a decoction because it's a hard material. So rather than just soaking it in hot water, boiled water, the way you would to make tea, you would want to chop the roots up or break them up and put them in water and simmer it for 20 minutes or so. And that will actually make a much stronger astringent compound. And you can turn rawhide into leather with it. It's got a lot of tannins in it. You can also, if you have a wound, an open wound, and you rinse it out, it will do sort of the same thing to that open wound that it's doing to the leather, which is that it's actually kind of changing the consistency of the proteins that it's coming in contact with because of the acids that it contains. So it's sort of making that tissue less susceptible to decomposing. It's like you're tanning it. It's like if you had a piece of leather and you wanted it to stay a piece of rawhide and you wanted it to stay leather, it would preserve it. This is doing the same thing to the tissue there. It's like it's making it so that that tissue is not as viable anymore, but it's actually preserving it so that it won't go so that it won't become necrotic either, so that it won't rot in the wound. It will actually sort of create something like a scab that will dry up and eventually turn into a scab by rinsing it with this stronger astringent decoction. And you don't have to do it while it's boiling hot or anything, but in some ways it has the same type of effect as if you did use very hot water on it, because it's sort of, you can also think of it as like the acids are cooking the tissue, making it into a different type of substance. Just a second. Yeah, raspberries are really good. It's, for a lot of people, raspberry is one of the first herbs that they learn about, because it's something that it's something that often comes along at a pivotal time in people's lives because of its effect on the reproductive system. And so a lot of the time it's something that people use and then, kind of start learning about other herbs from there. What I kind of think of as a gateway herb. But the other question was, can it be used as an emollient? It's not really very emollient. It's more astringent, but it could be used with some other things to make, a combination of astringent and emollient stuff, which can be a useful combination. Like, for example, mallow leaf would be a good one for that, but we haven't really talked about that so much yet. But internally, the raspberry leaf is, because of its astringency, is good for stopping severe diarrhea. If somebody's having just a lot of loss of fluid through their intestinal tract, you're wanting to make sure that there's, you're trying to prevent that deficiency state where they would be losing a lot of fluids and a lot of minerals because of diarrhea. A decoction of raspberry root is actually really helpful for that, and is very safe compared to some of the other things that might be used it doesn't stop peristalsis. It just has a very drying effect on the bowels. So there's still the movement of the muscles along the digestive tract. There just isn't so much fluid rushing through. And so it's not, you're not losing as much fluid through defecation that way. And so that's something that, can be potentially life-saving and is pretty simple, pretty uncomplicated remedy to use. And when I use raspberry root, I like to combine it with a little bit of either the vinegar or whatever form I have the fruit in, because the fruit actually makes it a lot more palatable and makes it and helps it to function a little bit, because you get if you have the vinegar form of it, you get the acids that are in the fruit, which are a little bit different. There's malic acid, there's some other acids that are in the fruit, and then there's acetic acid when it's made into a vinegar, and those go along with the tannic acids and the gallic acids that are in the roots. And so you have a whole lot of different astringent acids working together in the digestive system, or on the skin if you want to use it on the skin. But that's how I like to use the root of raspberry, is to make the decoction of it and then add just like a spoonful per 4 ounces or so of the vinegar that's made from the fruit. So raspberry also has raspberry and mullein both are herbs that you find in large amounts, that you can gather easily in large amounts, that are not threatened, not ecologically sensitive really, and that have a wide variety of uses and act on a variety of different systems. So my hope is that as we're going along, you're gathering a little, gathering the knowledge base to have a good home apothecary, a good little collection of herbs that you could use for a wide variety of different substances, a wide variety of different situations. And so I feel like these are good additions to that. Good, versatile, non-toxic, easy to use, easy to find, easy to harvest enough of, and all of that. Just a second. So mullein when there's an excess of phlegm, raspberry when there's a deficiency of certain nutrients, or when you're trying to prevent a deficiency in terms of dehydration. They all kind of can fit together into that type of framework. Similarly, some of the other herbs that we've talked about in the past would as well. There's a question of whether men can benefit from using raspberry internally. Well, they don't really have much of a uterus, but usually, so it's not going to have that particular effect, but it doesn't really do a lot hormonally. It doesn't contain anything like hormones, and it doesn't necessarily change the balance of hormones. So in men or in women who no longer have a uterus, it's totally fine to take it. It's not, it's got some nutrients to it, and it doesn't have much of a downside. And it's not going to, some herbs like red clover, for example, which is also used to support the reproductive system, would not be so good for men to take. If you took enough of it, it might make you develop breast tissue or something like that. But raspberry is not going to do anything like that. So it's totally okay for pretty much anyone to use. It's a very uncomplicated, very nourishing type of remedy. I've made tea and drank tea from it many times myself, and it's pretty enjoyable, and doesn't taste super medicine-y or anything like that. And so yeah, as far as easing the cycle, it will do that for just about anybody that has one. And it does actually have some benefits for menopausal type changes as well for some people. There are a lot of other things that also do that might be more powerful in that regards, but it does tend to be at least a little bit good for just about everybody.
What about for breastfeeding women? Is it contraindicated? Is it useful?
It's not contraindicated, and it's not necessarily directly going to pertain to that process, other than that it's nutritive, but it's not going to get in the way of anything either. And a lot of the time while people are breastfeeding, they might not have normal cycles, and it won't really force their cycle to return to normal or anything like that. It'll just kind of increase circulation to the uterus, which might result in the cycles returning more quickly, or it might not, depending on what else is going on in the endocrine system. But it's certainly not contraindicated. I have also at least once seen a situation where people had made herbal cigarettes that contain raspberry leaf, which I don't really think is very helpful either. So how would you prepare a tea to make it palatable? Well, first I would just make the tea very simply without any other ingredients. just the raspberry itself, raspberry leaf itself, and see what they think of that, because it doesn't taste that different from black tea. It's a little more sour, but not in an unpleasant way. I think that that's, you know, a good place to start and just see what they think of that. You can also dry the fruit and add that to the leaves, and that gives it more of a berry type of flavor, which some people find positive, enjoyable. You can combine it with hibiscus flowers, which is a nice way to take it too. It's kind of a flavor that goes together, makes it sort of tangy, but you know, maybe a little less sharp. And so I would start out with that and see what they think of it. And you know, both of my teenagers drank it some of the time, when they felt like they wanted anything at all. But a lot of the time they just, you know, didn't, and that was okay too. Yeah, I would try it plain and just kind of go from there. You can sweeten it. You know, some people like it to be sweet. Some people don't. So kind of, you can sweeten it with either like bits of the fruit, like I said, or with honey, something like that. But it's pretty palatable as far as herbal things go, though of course individual tastes vary, but it's not like, it's not bitter or very strongly medicinal tasting or anything like that. It's very, very mild, just sort of leafy tasting. To me, it tastes like the way the woods smell in fall, you know, just kind of that leaf smell and taste. So I've always thought it was a really pleasant kind of thing all by itself. I suppose you could try steeping it in apple juice, though I've never actually done that, but it seems like it would go okay. Mhm. Yeah, and there are a lot of combinations that contain raspberry leaf along with other things, and there are a lot of other good herbs that are for similar things that can be used along with it. And it's nice because it doesn't have a lot of interactions or contraindications or anything like that, where you would have to worry about, oh, can I take this with the other thing? It's usually pretty much fine. So when do I prefer the tincture of raspberry as opposed to a tea? I think that the tea is actually a better way to take it, because the warming aspect of the tea helps with its overall action. And also you're probably getting a larger dose of it in the tea. I use it as a tincture when I'm combining it with other tinctures and to make a formula. And I also use it as a tincture when I'm giving it to someone who doesn't want to drink tea or be bothered with making tea. And so it's kind of, can be a convenience thing, or it can be a matter of wanting to use a small dose of it along with some other things. So usually when I'm giving people the tincture that I have here, I'm doing it in combination with other things. So if somebody's got there are different things that I use it along with. One of them, which is partridge berry, for instance. I use partridge berry and raspberry, and sometimes an anti-inflammatory herb together, for helping regulate menstrual cycles and decrease painful stuff associated with periods and things like that. But it just kind of depends on individual needs. Yeah, Gretchen mentions the combination of raspberry, nettle, red clover, oat straw, and chamomile. So the oat straw and chamomile are relaxing to the muscles. The red clover, like I said, it has some estrogenic type compounds in it, and then the raspberry and nettle are both nutritive, and the raspberry is kind of tonic to the reproductive system. So they all work together really nicely. And there are a lot of combinations out there that are fairly similar, that are popular. So it combines very well with other herbs, and can be blended with just about anything that you enjoy the taste of as well. So yeah, another good herb to know about. And like I said, if you're anywhere near where I am, if you're in this eastern part of the United States, there's a good chance that black raspberries are fruiting near you right now, and be a good time to go out and pick some and taste it and get to know where the plant's growing, and get a firsthand feel for what the plant is like. Maybe harvest some for your personal use, that sort of thing. It's also a good time to be able to recognize it while it has the fruit on it, since the fruit is kind of the raspberry, the part that most of us are most familiar with, or they're originally familiar with. And once you're more familiar with it, you'll be able to see the leaves or even the stems growing and think, oh, there's some raspberry, even when it doesn't have the berries on it. But just getting started, sometimes it's easier to recognize it when it does have the berries on it. And that is right now, if you're in this part of the world, or even if you're somewhere else in the world that has similar weather. All right, let's see, any other questions about anything today? Well, I didn't get a chance to make the video talking about the plant collection process, so I'm still working on that, but I'll hopefully get that finished soon. And just want to say happy midsummer, happy solstice to everybody, and enjoy those long days, and try and do your best to stay safe from the too high temperatures, which of course can, provoke that type of deficiency state that we were talking about earlier. If you sweat too much, or if you get an excess of heat, that can be, bad too. So be careful out there. Right now here in Lexington, it's we've been having 90-degree days, and it's a bit early in the year for that. So yeah, be careful with the unseasonable or unusually high heat that's out there, but also try and enjoy those extra long days while you can. And it's a good time for getting out there and looking at some of the plants that are growing near you, and familiarizing yourself with this part of the cycle of the year. Well, thank you all very much, and I will get this video posted in the next day or so, and I will see you all again soon.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.